Well, hello, and welcome to our second of our video makeup classes. Apologies once again for not being able to be there in person, but this is the nature of modern science, I guess. We'll see how this goes. Hope this will be helpful and entertaining. This talk, we are going to be discussing many of the events of the 16th and 17th centuries. That's from 1500 to 1700. And it includes a huge range of material because a lot happened in that time period. Elements of religion, which we discussed before, but particularly how our discussion of religion before began to impact the politics and economy of the world at the time. Also, how Europe's position began to fit into a new global economy, and how the world began to change with the invention of new ways of looking at things. So we'll start with the concepts of economics, religion, and politics, and how those began to play together in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, if you remember, our discussion last time was really about the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. That is the Protestant Reformation and how that changed the nature of Christendom, as it were. Now, one thing it did, without question, was divide the West into two broad religious camps, Protestants and Catholics. That is, the Protestants such as Lutherans, Calvins, and the radical reformers like the Anabaptists, and the Roman Catholic Church on the other side. This meant it was an end of Christendom, as it was, or at least Christendom in the West, this view of a united belief system, even though that had not really been the case since shortly after the Council of Nantes, when the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox split. But it definitely led to a greater form of religious pluralism, that is, more forms of Christianity across the area. And that Reformation touched absolutely every aspect of Western society, not just because of the way it impacted politics, but also because of the way it impacted the economies, and of course, because of the wars that it started. And this had vast implications for the nature of political authority throughout the West, particularly the concepts of the separation between religion and politics. Prior to that, if you remember, in the Middle Ages, things were more or less unified, that the king reigned because it was God's will and was anointed by the Pope and things like that. Here, with the introduction of the Reformation and the pluralism of Christianity within the West, we see a necessary or divide between the concepts of religion and of politics. And it was definitely the beginning of the modern period. Now today, we're going to talk about a wide range of things, as I said. We're going to talk about the military revolution. That is to say, how the military was changed due to the contact with China and India. We're going to talk about politics and the religious wars that resulted from the Reformation, and how the Middle Ages changed into the early modern historic period. We're also going to look briefly at Max Weber's concepts that capitalism and the rise of capitalism was directly related to the Reformation. And from there, we're going to look at the rise also of global politics. That is to say, how Europe went from being a kind of backwards corner of the world to being part of a new, globally reaching political and economic system. And after all of that, we're going to move on to the scientific revolution. That is to say, the changes that all of these things had, particularly the nature of the wars and the changes in culture, as well as the spreading out of Europeans across the world and their access to other ideas, how that began to change the way people thought and sort of gave birth to the scientific revolution, which some people, including Niall Ferguson, say almost defines the West today. So to give you a big picture, what we're going to be talking about is the Protestant Revolution, how that influenced the military revolution. We'll discuss in brief the events between Spain and England. We'll talk about the French wars of religion, the rise of the Huguenots, and then the 30 Years' War, which is personally my personal favorite topic of this class, and we're only going to be touching it briefly. Now, just to give you a really big picture, I've included this slide here so you can see how all the different characters somewhat interplay back and forth across these zones. You'll note that we have elements of the French dynasties up here. We get the English dynasties down here. And just note how that plays into things like, say, Luther's 95 Thesis, how the Protestant Reformation occurred, Council of Trent, all those things we talked about last time. And then how the wars of religion in France and the 30 Years' War and eventually the Glorious Revolution in England, which we'll talk about, how those all played together back and forth. As well as the Spanish Armada, who's king where, how that all happens, and how that then ties into natures of the exploration periods, first of the Spanish and the Portuguese, then of the English, French, and Dutch later, the rise of the African slave trade, which we'll be discussing this time, and then different scientific inventions, different scientific creations down here: Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton. So this is really included so that you get an idea and you can look back and see who's king where, what's happening. What's happening? Is Descartes part of the 30 Years' War? Is he influenced by that? Galileo, how does that relate to the Catholic Reformation? Stuff like that. Okay. So we'll start with the military revolution. And we start with that because the nature of conflict in Europe at the time changed dramatically. We see a change from the medieval world, where you have knights on horseback fighting each other and archers, to what we think of as the beginning of modern combat, things such as the use of firearms and cannons and things like that. The disappearance of armor from the battlefield and the appearance of guns. So how did this all happen? Well, you could say it happened due to our contact with China, because for some time before this, China had gunpowder. Now, some people say that the Chinese only used gunpowder for fireworks, and that's just fundamentally wrong. They did use it in siege works and cannons and bombs and things like that. But their cannons were not as developed as the West later developed its cannonry, and certainly firearms did not develop as quickly. Now, why is that? Now, funny enough, it's not for what many reasons that many people think. It's not because the West was somehow scientifically or culturally more adept at turning this technology directly into warfare. Rather, it's because of a pre-existing type of technology that came directly out of the West's religious followings. And that is the way people were called to prayer in Christianity. Now, in Islam, people are called to prayer by the sound of a man's voice. And in other religions, there are different things. But in the West, people are called to prayer by the sound of bells. Now, there's a long reason for that, and it's not particularly significant to the topic. What is significant to the topic is that the creation of a bell that could have a longer, more sonorous sound that would ring louder and longer was very important to the prestige and the identity of different communities. So a great deal of time and effort went into being able to smelt and forge a bell that kept its sound longer, that had fewer imperfections in it. Now, if you listen to many Oriental bells, they make a beautiful sound, but they are more of a, they don't tend to last as long. It is more of a thong noise, whereas the bells of St. Mary, for example, or the bells of Notre Dame, you will hear that they have long, sonorous sounds with multiple different tones all playing together. Now, the reason this is because the way the bells are cast, and the bells, as I said before, became important to each community, that its bells were the most beautiful sounding bells that they could possibly afford. And that meant that each bit of iron being cast had to be free of imperfections and had to vary in thickness. It meant for a very specific type of iron casting. And that type of iron casting, by chance, makes for also more stable cannons. The reason is very simple. There are fewer imperfections in it. They are more uniform in the way the iron is flowed and the way the thickness of it throughout. And because of that, that made there be fewer imperfections in the cannons as the technology of how to cast a bell was applied to that into how to cast first cannons and later firearms. And so the rise of the firearm and of the cannon fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. It removed the importance of armor because a bullet could go straight through it. It created much more effective mass slaughtering devices on the field because cannons could, of course, be loaded with cannonballs or with buck and ball, which is a combination of a big ball and some smaller pieces of more like buckshot that would shoot through lines of troops. As a result, it changed the nature of how combat was made. And that in turn changed the nature of fortifications. Now, in the medieval period, fortifications were synonymous with castles. But the advent of the modern firearm, particularly the cannon, made very short work of castle walls. A cannonball could blast through a castle wall much more readily than anything like a trebuchet or a catapult could. But, and it was discovered almost by accident, a cannonball would be stopped by mounded earth, particularly if you have a brick wall in front of it. So the change of forts went from being fortifications, I should say rather, went from being a fortification of the castle wall to what became the fort, or the fortification that became known as the Star Fort. And you can see how it's shaped here like a star, a big star along here. Now, the reason it's shaped like a star also has to do with the advent of firearms. If you look at this area that I'm highlighting here in, I'll pick green. Here, we'll highlight it in green. This area here. Maybe green wasn't a very good color because you can't see it. Maybe we'll do it in red. This area here that area has an open field of fire on the defenses in front of it. In fact, if these outer walls are breached, they can be fired upon by two directions at the same time, making it harder to access. So the nature of the walls changed, where they were stone walls filled with earthen levels that would stop the cannonballs, and the shapes changed. Rather than having circular towers from which you could shoot all around, stars became important. Stars embedded within stars, giving open range of multiple fire to multiple targets. Now that in turn changed domestic architecture, because no longer did the lord need to live in his castle. In fact, you wouldn't really want to live in a star fort. It's not a particularly nice place to live. But domestic architecture began to take on airs that were for show only. And here in Hardwick Hall, for example, built in the 1590s, it was renowned as being more window than wall. Here it's a house made for show, not a house made for defense. And here is another key element that starts changing across the time period. Prestige display became about more than just showing strength and power. It also became about showing artwork and elegance. That, again, is a element not of the Reformation, but of the Renaissance. And that elegance and prestige could be gained outside the field of combat. Now, these, of course, had their impact on politics as well. Particularly, the way politics was done became, again, a matter more of show, but also that as conflicts arose, the warfare and the nature of warfare became a larger and, in fact, more deadly affair. Now, here in the 16th century began a change where the religious differences between Protestants and Catholics began to create religious conflicts. And effectively, there became an intermittent war for religion over more than a century. And all of this was really based around attempts to reunify Christendom. The Catholics wanted everyone coming back to being Catholic. The Protestants wanted everybody to convert to their form of Protestantism, often their very particular form of Protestantism. And this led to a wide range of wars and massacres. And religion and politics got badly muddled throughout the time period. Now, to give you an idea of what's going on, this is another reference. The really big picture, the monarchical complex. Who's king where? This is all going to come back and forth. If you get confused, it just gives you an idea. The idea very simply is that we talk about dynasties at the top of each country, and we talk about individual emperors or kings below that. And you'll remember back in 1500 we had Henry VII quickly becoming Henry VIII in England. We had the Valois dynasty starting with Louis XII, which we'll see will end with Henry III. In the Holy Roman Empire, we had Maximilian I, and in Spain, we had Ferdinand and Isabella. In Portugal, we had Manuel I. Now, if you also remember, in the Holy Roman Empire, I had talked about how it was disunified and how Maximilian I really spent a lot of time on his armor. Well, he also spent a lot of time doing other things because, as I mentioned before, he was a Habsburg. And Habsburgs were about creating political unity, not necessarily just through war, but through marriages. and we'll see how Maximilian I's political and marriage-related machinations led to a wide range of events that occurred thereafter. But we'll start with France. France in the 15th and 16th centuries became a divided nation, divided between Catholics and the crown on one side, and Huguenots, that is, primarily Protestant nobles on the others. The Protestant nobles often took on these religious beliefs due to true belief, but also sometimes did it in part just to get out from underneath the king. Because if the king is of a different faith, then you can say that there is a slightly different element to the way one needs to follow him. And this division between Protestant Huguenots and Catholic monarchists ended up with what is known as the French Wars of Religion from 1562 to 1598. So yes, over 30 years worth of conflict. It was, as I said before, the Catholics versus the Huguenots, that is French Protestants, and was on the political side an off-and-on civil war between noble factions, that is, the Catholic factions on one side, the Protestant factions on the other, with the crown, of course, being Catholic, but trying to create a form of peace between the two. And it led to two very fundamentally different approaches to the way one could conduct oneself. It led to the approach of le politique, which is politics above all else, looking for peace and stability over religious convictions. That is to say, that it is more important to live side by side and without killing each other than it is for another person to follow your faith. And the other is doctrinaire, that is, a view of the world based on one's religious convictions, and that was above politics and stability, that one's belief, one's faith was more important than the political interactions or stability or avoiding war. Now, France was back and forth with different ways of ruling through all of this until the day of the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, which is where things really took off into a new and even more violent form. Now, St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre is a fascinating event. The Huguenots, particularly the nobles, had gathered, many of them in Paris, for a very important wedding. And so there was a large number of Huguenots in Paris on this particular day. Now, on that day, on one of the churches, someone, and we don't really know who, but someone nailed up a list of reasons why the Catholics were terrible and the way that they should change. So it was thought to have been a Protestant. Of course, there are some people who argue it was false flag attack. That is to say that it was done later just to justify what ended up happening. But this so enraged the Catholic population that it led to first riots and then the massacring of a huge proportion of the Huguenot followers. There was violence in the street. There was total bloodshed. And a very large number of the Huguenots were killed. And this, of course, worsened the conflict between the Huguenots and the Catholics. Catholics, yes. So then along came Catherine de' Medici. Now, she was the wife of the then King of France, but the then king died, and their child son, Henry III, became the king, and she was made regent. She was part of the Medici clan, that is, the very important Italian family that was so important during the Renaissance in Italy. And she favored a limited form of Huguenots. That is to say, she had a much more Machiavellian view towards the world, and certainly favored the view of the politique. That is to say, that she thought politics, rather than religious considerations, should be the prime view of a king. Now, that being the case, she decided to take a very interesting step. Now, Henry III was still a child, and so if he were to die, the next person on the throne would be this man, Henry of Navarre, who was the head of the Bourbon family, who was a Protestant and one of the absolutely most important Huguenots around. In fact, he was the single head of the Huguenots, if you could say the Huguenots had a single head. And he had a lot of influence, both as the head of the Bourbons and as the head of the Huguenots. And so Catherine decided to suggest a marriage between Princess Margaret and Henry of Navarre. Henry responded by saying, Paris is worth a mass. That is to say, that ruling France and doing it peacefully was worth converting. So they married, and he converted back to Catholicism. This allowed for a very sophisticated, peaceful solution to occur, which was fantastic, and a political solution began. But then, well, one of the seminarians, a Catholic seminarian, was so enraged by the fact that there should be any form of toleration of the Huguenots, and this man was clearly mad, by the way, there's no question about that. He decided that the king must pay, so he murdered the young King Henry. Now, this was an incredibly stupid thing to do, because not only did this create additional conflict, but it also meant that Henry of Navarre went from being Henry of Navarre to being Henry IV. He was the next in line, and he was married to Princess Margaret, so the head of the Huguenots, the head of the Bourbon family, became King of France. And this led to a large number of events. First of all, it led to the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which spoke about the toleration for Protestants, that they should be tolerated legally under the French throne. It also consolidated the French monarchy. All of those different factions now fell together underneath the rule of the Bourbons. So the Huguenots were somewhat brought in underneath the same rule. The Catholics couldn't object because he had converted to Catholicism, and his wife was certainly a Catholic, and his children would probably be Catholic. So it consolidated the French monarchy and made for a much stronger king. And it introduced a period of peace in France for a time, until about 1610, when Henry IV was assassinated by another Catholic, for similar reasons as Henry III was, and that put his son, Louis XIII, becoming King of France. And his regent was a man named Cardinal Richelieu, who we'll come back to later. So, just to give you an idea, this is what we've been talking about up here. We've got the Valois dynasty with Henry III assassinated, Henry of Navarre becoming king, and then also being assassinated, and then Louis XIII becoming king. That moves us on to England. Now, if you remember, back at the turn of the century, Henry VIII was the King of England, and he wanted a male heir, so he ended up separating the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church. It remained pretty much the same in its form, but he was now the head, so he granted himself a divorce because he wanted a male heir, and his wife would had only produced one daughter whose name was Mary. He then married Anne Boleyn, who gave him another daughter, and then perhaps did some things that were not so clever when you have such an angry husband, and she ended up beheaded. Then he had another wife who he apparently loved very much, but she died. Then there was another wife who he divorced. Then there was another wife who he beheaded. And finally, he had a wife who survived. But he did manage to get a son out of all of this. And so this is the important thing. Edward VI became King of England after Henry VIII. He remained a Protestant. He kept it a Protestant nation, but he died relatively young. He was always somewhat sickly, but he died relatively young. And that led only one logical choice, that Mary I, that is, his Henry VIII's daughter from his first marriage, should become queen. So she returned to England, and with her came many Catholics, and she, who grew up in Spain, wanted to return England to being a Catholic country, and she was backed by not surprisingly, by the Catholic nobles, particularly those who were in the north. They backed her and became known as Bloody Mary because of the many massacres that occurred during the time period. Mind you, the fact that there were massacres under both Henry VIII and Edward VI is another story. But she married Philip II of Spain. Philip II of Spain, who was the grandson of Ferdinand and Catherine of Spain, but also the grandson of Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire. So they are looking at a potentially unified Spain, England, and Holy Roman Empire. So, to understand how this all relates, we have Henry VIII, who is Protestant, and Charles V, who is he is the grandson of all those people. Philip is the great-grandson. And you end up with Mary, Queen of England, marrying Philip II, King of Spain and the Netherlands. They become co-regents, co-ruling England. And this created, as I noted, a bit of fear in some people, because you're talking about a really unified Europe. Only France is sitting there on the outside, and believe me, France wasn't looking at this all too well. Neither were the English Catholics, or the English Protestants, by the way, particularly when Mary seemed to have become pregnant. Unfortunately, she wasn't pregnant, or fortunately, depending on whose side you are on. She, in fact, had a tumor and died. And that left Elizabeth I, Queen of England. Ta-da! She becomes known in history as Good Queen Bess. And she solidified England as a Protestant nation. And there's no doubt about that. She was just as bloody about it as Mary had been bloody about turning it over to Catholicism. But she also proved to be a very powerful ruler in general, and even won the grudging respect of the Pope. But also, at the same time, Elizabeth had been engaging what she referred to as privateers. Those are people like Drake and the like, to how do we put it, harass Spanish shipping, particularly the ships filled with gold and silver coming out of the New World. And so this caused a somewhat aggravated Spain against England anyways. So with these two things combined, in 1588, Philip II of Spain massed the largest naval force seen since the classical periods and launched it up against England. Now, this Spanish Armada was seen as a terrible threat, obviously, but it faced quite a problem. First of all, it was harried the entire way by the very small, fast, and agile English ships. Secondly, as it came around towards Calais, the English, led by Drake, launched forth a huge selection of fire ships. That is, old hulk of ships with a couple of sails on them and filled with wood and oil that they set fire to and just went into the anchored Spanish Armada, causing all sorts of mayhem. This caused the Spanish to have to flee around the east coast of England, up around Scotland, being harassed the entire time by the English warships until they went around. They attempted to come down again by going around Ireland, but were caught by terrible seasonal storms. Many of them crashed up against the Irish shores. Many more of them were lured by Irish pirates to their doom. What they would do is they'd stand there with a light saying, "Oh, look, we're a safe harbor. You can come over here." But in fact, they were drawing them onto rocks. And then the Irish would go off and actually just rip all of the goods off of these Spanish ships and kill the Spanish. They weren't particularly in favor of the English in this. Rather, they just wanted the gold. So in the end, only a third of the ships returned to Spain. And that was considered a devastating blow to the Spanish. It wasn't really, actually. The Spanish actually really were not that greatly impacted by it. But more importantly, England was unified by it. England gained a new sense of nationality, a sense of nationality that it hadn't had since Henry VIII had died, and possibly even before then. There's nothing like a foreign invasion to bring people together. And it definitely solidified Elizabeth's position on the throne. Now, here we go back to the big picture where we saw, again, Charles I and V of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire has two sons, Philip II of Spain, who marries Mary I of England, and his other son, who becomes Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor. Now, we'll get on to there because really now we're going to start looking at what's going on in the Holy Roman Empire. And here, again, religion comes back into it. If you remember, the Protestant Reformation really had its start in the Holy Roman Empire when Luther nailed his 95 Thesis to the cathedral. But also, it saw a large group of Calvinists gain in power. And you can see in 1600 how Europe was divided. Scotland was Calvinist, England was Anglican, Ireland was divided between Anglican and Calvinist, Anglican and Catholic, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were all Lutheran, very Lutheran, under the rule of Gustavus Adolphus I, a very, very potent king we'll come back to in a moment. And then, of course, there was the Catholic states of France and Spain and much of the Holy Roman Empire. And in the Holy Roman Empire, you had the largest division of religions. Now, if you remember, there was a treaty that was made that declared that the religion of the prince of any of the states inside the Holy Roman Empire was considered the official religion of that state. Well, this led to an interesting situation. You see, after Maximilian II died, his son Matthias took over. And when Matthias was getting old, he named Ferdinand II to be the heir of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, whereas Maximilian II and Charles V were all politique above all else, Ferdinand was a firm believer in the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So he believed in the policy of doctrine. And what he did was he sent a delegation to Prague, which was in Bohemia, it was the capital of Bohemia, and was one of the Protestant strongholds. And he basically had this delegation go forward and say that the way he was interpreting the law was that since he was Catholic, that he was therefore the prince of the princes, and therefore everyone should be Catholic. Well, the Protestant nobles in Prague, of course, didn't like this very much. They didn't like it because it meant that he was saying you either convert or I take all of your lands, or maybe even kill you because you're traitors. And so they got a bit angry about this. Now, the ambassadors he sent were no fools. They were important men, and they figured that they would probably be taken prisoner and held, and there'd be negotiations, and maybe war would break out, but that they would be held and held responsibly. What they didn't predict was exactly how angry the Protestant nobles were going to be, nor did they really recognize some of the historic elements, because some centuries before, something similar had happened. And so what the Protestant nobles did was take the Catholic ambassadors from the Holy Roman Emperor and defenestrate them. That means literally to throw them out a window. A 70-foot tall window, 4 stories, they fell down and survived. Now, if you ask the Catholics of the time period, they said they survived by a miracle. If you ask the Protestants of the time period, they say they survived by falling into an exceptionally large pile of dung. Either way, what neither of them foresaw coming was, in fact, that this would launch the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest and most destructive wars ever to have hit Europe. Now, the 30 Years' War, I could talk all day about the 30 Years' War. In fact, I would love to give a class just on the 30 Years' War. It was a classic, fascinating political time period. It was marked by political shifting alliances that makes the Game of Thrones look like child's play. And these alliances were not always based on religion. Sometimes they were, but other times they were not. For example, the French king, Louis XIII, under the guidance of Cardinal Richelieu, sided with the Protestants rather than with the Catholics. Why? Well, because this was in the best interest of France. It did not serve France particularly well to be surrounded on one side by the Holy Roman Empire, who is directly related to the Spanish Empire on the other side, now quickly becoming the richest country in Europe, and possibly with claims going back and forth to England. So the French decided to back the Protestants. The war was grisly and terrible, and it reduced Germany's population by 30%. Think of that. 1 out of every 3 of us in this room would be dead. And it was a terrible conflict. People were tortured, cities were burned, armies would move through, steal the food of the population. There were people called Burnmeisters in charge of, as part of these armies, whose job it was to find all the food, money, and gold in every town, and they'd often do this by either burning the town or, as in this illustration, burning the people in the town and offering to kill them rather than let them keep suffering. It was a devastating war on any front. And at its end, at the Peace of Westphalia, many things occurred. For one, it was decided, yes, indeed and true, that each ruler would be able to choose the religion for their state. But there would be religious toleration underneath that, so that if you were a Catholic ruler, you had to accept the fact there are Protestants in your domain. And if you're a Protestant ruler, you had to accept that there were Catholics in your domain. Muslims and Jews, that's another story altogether. It also created a division of Europe along a north-south line when it comes to religion. If you look at European maps, the northern parts of Europe tend to be Protestant, and the southern parts of Europe tend to be Catholic. And it put in place a political geography and a political setup that was to influence the next several centuries of global politics. In fact, in my view, if you look at the 30 Years' War, it had a direct impact on everything that happened right up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. You could draw a straight line between them. For one thing, it created new areas. It created the Dutch Republic, which had previously been ruled by the Holy Roman Empire, but now was an independent state. But most importantly, it created a balance of power across Europe, one that was unstable and shifting, but one that people recognized needed to be maintained, or not all people recognize that, but there needed to be control and power, and it set this balance of power and set up what would be the next 100 years of conflict and peace across the West. So that by 1648, this is the map of Europe. The Scotland and England end up becoming combined when Elizabeth I dies without heir, and her next in line is, in fact, the person who was James VI of Scotland. So he became James I of England and Scotland and created what is now known as the Commonwealth, or the United Kingdom. You have the United Provinces of Holland. You have the Spanish Netherlands formed up here. You see the divisions of the different things. You see the old boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire and how the Austrian Habsburgs end up ruling certain areas, while the Brandenburg Prussians end up ruling other areas across the Duchy of Prussia and Saxony over here. And you see really the final divide and collapse of the Holy Roman Empire. It's now sometimes said to exist in theory, but really what you have is a series of independent states. And of course, meanwhile, throughout all of this, you had the Ottoman Empire doing quite well and dominating everywhere from Hungary to, well, Iraq. So quite powerful. And it really, as I said before, creates the setup of the modern world. The 30 Years' War divided Christendom between Catholics and Protestants, which is something you can still see today. The 30 Years' War set the political background for the following events, things that we'll be discussing in this class. Things like the rise of absolutism in France and Prussia, that is, that the king has absolute power, whereas you have the rise of parliamentarism in England, that is, a sharing of power between the monarch and the parliament. It also positioned France as the greatest military power in Europe at that moment, while Spain became the greatest economic power at that moment, and set factionalism throughout the German states. It also set the stage for some elements of justification for imperial expansion, particularly the belief that their own countries had the right to do things, and also that they were spreading the word of God. Not just any word of God, but that they were in competition to spread Christendom. The Catholics needed to spread the Catholic word of God, while the Protestants needed to spread the Protestant word of God. And there are some people who argue that it also led to the primacy of capitalism in the West. Now, what do I mean by that? And what do we mean by capitalism? Well, capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production and the creation of goods or services for profit. That is to say that that individuals own the means to make things, and that they make things or they provide services for the purpose of giving profit to the individuals who own the system. And the key ingredients of capitalism are competition, that old Greek concept of arete, of that it thrives when people compete to do well. The consumer wins, because if company A is offering a good widget for $60 and company B promotes a better widget for $50, company B is going to do better. That's going to drive company A to make a better widget still. It also led to the accumulation of money or financial assets to make more money into the hands of a few people. That is capital became the key. The ability to accumulate money or to have enough assets to make more money is the fundamental ingredient of capitalism. Now, there are those, like Max Weber, shown here, who believe that capitalism was the direct result of the Reformations, the 30 Years' War, and the Protestant work ethic. Basically, what he did, he says, what causes people to behave the way they do? And Weber said that it was the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism that do this. He did this in 1904, by the way. Now, what is the Protestant work ethic? We hear about this once in a while. Sometimes we hear about it as the American work ethic, but really they're talking about the Protestant work ethic. And the idea behind it is that one should work hard, one should work frugally, and one should gain prosperity. By frugally, I mean, of course, that one should try to save money where one can, and that together these things will bring prosperity, that will bring wealth to you. And that it is a worldly work. It is a duty to do this. that benefits both the individual and society as a whole. So that it is not just a good thing for an individual to work hard, but that as society gain that rather to say that the individual doesn't just gain through the Protestant work ethic, but that the whole society gains through it. Now, if you think back to what we discussed about Catholicism, the Catholic idea was that good works as well as faith are required to be saved. Whereas the Protestant idea was that good works were only a consequence of having already received salvation. So good people will be good people because they are already saved. And therefore, someone who works hard will work hard and be rewarded because it is God's will. The question is, where did capitalism really begin? Well, we saw elements of capitalism in the Middle Ages, didn't we? We saw the rise of mercantile banks and things like that before there was ever a Protestantism. So some people argue that it was really in the 14th century Italy that it occurred. Others argue that it was in Northern Europe after the Protestant Reformation. And some note that particularly the Netherlands, particularly Amsterdam, in the 16th century is where capitalism came together. Well, according to Weber, his model suggests that the ethical dualism needs to be overcome. That is to say, one needs to overcome the concept that doing well for oneself is in conflict with doing well for society, and that creates an economic ethic. He also goes forward and says that there was a reducing influence of magic, that is to say, of religious ritual, and that he associated with Catholicism. That also led to the economic ethic. He notes that Western feudalism led to the Western city, which is not something I necessarily agree with. He noted that Roman law led to a rational state, and that a rational state is also the product of removing religious concepts from it. So, a rational state, a state based on reason, and that there is a rational science that develops, and we'll be discussing that in a minute. Together, the Western city and the rational state come up with a concept of free labor. That is to say that it frees the labor force to work instead of towards a religious or ideological goal, towards a rational goal for their own or the state betterment. He notes that the economic ethic led to a spirit of capitalism, that one can amass wealth and goods, and that the Western city created the urban bourgeoisie, that is, the middle classes wealthy enough to actually invest. And so that by having the spirit of capitalism, that is to say, the concept that one should and can invest or accumulate wealth to gain more wealth, and by having people who have that wealth and are the product of a rational state, it leads naturally to capitalist entrepreneurship. Whether you believe this or not is totally up to you. But it does set the stage for what we're going to be discussing next. And what we're discussing next is Europe and the world. That is how Europe suddenly entered onto a world stage where previously it had been a backwater. And so now we enter into how Europe transformed and became part of a global system. And from the big picture sort of things, we're going to be looking at Spanish and Portuguese exploration, followed by French, English, and Dutch exploration. We'll possibly cover a bit of the Glorious Revolution in England, but we will definitely be focusing on the African slave trade and talk a little bit about the golden age of piracy. Now, it's important to begin by understanding where the world was in, say, 1450. This map shows a European view of the world in 1450. You will note that it notes the world as more or less being round. It is a navigational map. You'll note that the world sort of ends in Africa. They don't know what is going on too far south in Africa, and that out in the east things are mysterious and kind of unknown. You'll note that most of the routes noted are trade routes. There's some vague recognition of mountain chains here and there, and that the further east you go, the less detail there is. Now you compare that to a map made just 100 years later, in 1570, or a little more than 100 years later. You can see this map of the world is much more recognizable to us. For one thing, Europe, Africa, Asia, they all have the familiar shapes that they should have. The new worlds, well, the North America is somewhat mapped out, though you'll note that there's a belief that there's supposed to be a great passage that somehow one can travel by sea all the way off to the Pacific, following the Great Lake systems, one supposes, into the Gulf of Mexico or into Baja California area. South America, well, it's a little globular in its shape, and Australia doesn't really exist, still part of Antarctica, or as it was known, or more likely, Antarctica was part of Terra Australis Nodum Cognita, in other words, the land that we do not know. There's rumor of it, but no one's really been there. But still, the world looks more or less the way we view it today, certainly more so than on the previous map. Now the question is, what set the Europeans out to explore the world? What made them go from being this content little backwater to that fought amongst itself, to, in the 1400s and the Middle Ages, to reaching out and stretching across the world? What was the driving factors? Well, you could easily say that it is fame, fortune, and faith. Or put another way, glory, gold, and God. That is to say, individual Europeans and nations wanted the fame and the glory of going out and finding things. But more than that, there was a look for money. Money was essential, money both for the nation that they were working for and for the individual. But behind all of it, there was also an element of religion. That there was the need to spread the word of God and save souls. And as Christendom broke into Protestantism versus Catholicism, there was a competition to see who could spread their faith the farthest and the fastest. Now, that was the faith part of it. But as for the fortune part of it, in order to understand that, one has to understand what's referred to as Asia's Great Divergence, or, in other words, the historical role of China and India in the world prior to the 19th century. Now, if you look at this map over here, the history of the world's gross domestic product, you can see that in the year 1, the year where Augustus was king, emperor of Rome, that the vast bulk of the world's wealth was tied up not in the West, but in fact was focused on China and a lot of it in India. That is where many of the most valuable items were. After all, China had a thousands-year-old dynasty empire at that point. India had thousands-year-old cultural traditions continuing on, and that maintained its position until around 1500, when parts of Europe began to gain bigger portions of it. Also, other countries as well. Japan, you note, starts gaining a much larger chunk of the gross national product, the world's gross product in about 1000 BC, AD. Sorry, apologies. And Italy still maintains the biggest chunk of things, but Britain starts to grow as well. And as we move forward to 1600 and 1700, all of these chunks keep growing as well, but not so much at the cost of the majority of the wealth staying in India and in China. Oh, China gets a bigger share, that's for sure. At 1600, it starts getting a bigger share of the world's wealth. That evens out again, once again, around 1700. But until 1820, the bulk of the world's wealth is tied up in the empires of China and in India. And then at around the middle of the 19th century, that shifts dramatically so that the West starts getting more and more portions. And you notice the United States appears in there, that formula as well, until by 1970, China and India only have a tiny fraction of the world's GDP, though still the United States doesn't have as large a bit of it as China did earlier or India did earlier. And then after 1970, that starts to change again. We in fact start getting a world in which China starts increasing its hold as well. This is what's called the Great Divergence, where the wealth switched from being primarily in Asia, which it had been through most of history, and during this time period we're talking about, you start seeing the things that set the economic picture to be different in the following centuries. Now, let's go back again and think about two sets of explorers. One is Zheng He, who you've heard about in the readings, and the other is Christopher Columbus. And Zheng He's treasure ship is shown in the background there. That is the huge, magnificent ship there, whereas the Santa Maria, the largest of Christopher Columbus's ships, is shown in the foreground. That gives you a difference in the level of technology that was held in these different ships at that time period. That the Chinese really had the focus on trade and exchange. Now, something else to realize when talking about getting around the world is the way that the winds work. In this world, we are tied, or we were tied, to power by the winds. You cannot have a galley that is something that's manned by oars that's going to go long distances. That just doesn't work. If you get it too far away from shore, it's not stable. The places where the oars have to be low enough to the water line that they can get swamped. It doesn't work very well. But if you look at the way the winds trade here, you see that Europe, it's a little bit hard to get out of Europe. You'll note that the trade winds come blasting along this way, and they somewhat shove you either down south and then back out to sea, or push you back into the European coast. Meanwhile, Similar difficulties exist elsewhere, but the Indian Ocean, which I wish this was centered on, has a much clearer set of trade and exchange winds. So there's a lot of exchange that can occur around the Indian Ocean. It gets harder as we get out there. And one of the big changes that occurred was the changes in naval technology. That is to say, in how ships were built in Europe that allowed them to start plowing across and against the winds. Now, another of the most important elements is changes in navigation, and that is particularly the introduction of the quadrant and of the astrolabe. Now, the quadrant is called a quadrant because it is 1/4, one quad, of an astrolabe. And an astrolabe works by measuring the distance between the horizon, which you view along one line, and a given star or the sun. Now see the horizon. What you do is you sight along a level to note where the horizon is, and then you measure on effectively what we think of as a protractor, the degrees above the horizon that a given star is. And most particularly, that is normally associated with the North Star. It's also associated with the Southern Cross. But the key is, by knowing how far above the horizon the North Star is, you can determine where you exist north or south on the globe. The further south you are, down here, the lower the North Star is going to be on the horizon. You're going to be just viewing it. Oh, you can just barely see it right here. It's almost a straight line. Well, if I could draw a straight line. Whereas if you're 30 degrees, the North Star is going to be a little higher. And if you're right on the North Pole, the North Star is right immediately overhead. That's a terrible drawing. Hold on, let me get rid of that. There. So if you're on the North Pole, the North Star is directly overhead. Whereas if you're on the equator, it's actually right on the horizon. The same is true, a little bit different using the Southern Cross. So latitude is easy to tell. It's easy to tell where you are on the globe, north or south, based on being able to measure the stars. But longitude is much more difficult. In order to determine longitude, one must know what time it is in a given location that the sun rises, and what time the sun rises where you are. So let's say we know that the sun rises at 6 o'clock in Greenwich, England, right there. And we are headed westward, out across the Atlantic. Well, if we want to find out how far we are west, what we need to do is know what time the sun rises in Greenwich, which we've known for thousands of years. Stonehenge is able to tell you when the sun rises at a given point in a given time. So all you need to do is make a timetable of it. It's a constant. So you measure that you know that on a given day it's going to rise at 6 a.m. in Greenwich Mean Time in Greenwich. Then out here at sea, you have a clock that says what time it is in Greenwich. And when the sun rises here, you note what time the sun rises wherever you are. Let's say the Bahamas, since that's kind of where I'm pointing here. If you know what time the sun rises in the Bahamas and what time it is in Greenwich when the sun rises in the Bahamas, you can figure out how far west you are based on the difference in the times. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Now, put together, these two things led to the ability for Europeans since they're the ones who developed the more manageable, smaller sized clocks. The clock was a Chinese invention, but it was worked upon and developed in greater detail by the Europeans. They took a good idea and ran with it. And the reason they did so, in part, was in order for navigational things. This is why we end up with clocks seeming to dominate our lives. But effectively, using these navigational elements and a particular type of sail and sailing style that was picked up from the Arabs, the Europeans set out, particularly the Europeans for the Iberian Peninsula, set out on two major courses well, I was about to say destruction, which in this case also applies, but I meant exploration. They set out Columbus, of course, famously headed out to the Indies, West Indies, came back and discovered the New World, opening up both North and South America to Spanish conquistadores, whereas the Portuguese focused on sailing south, initially heading out this direction, trying to find the Cape of Africa, coming in to the Cape of Good Hope, finally getting around it, and opening up the Indian Ocean to Portuguese merchants, and particularly their armed merchants, which you hear about again in the books. Later, Magellan and Elcano do the unthinkable, which is they sail south, and in the attempt to discover the end of South America, they end up sailing around the Straits of Magellan and doing something remarkable. They circumnavigate the globe. They are the first people to ever sail all around the globe. Now, what this meant to Europe was that it now had access to those earlier Chinese and Indian stores of wealth and power. But it also, for the Spanish in particular, and later the Portuguese, opened up a new world, which was filled, in their view, with gold and silver, particularly since the Spanish first came across the Aztecs and then the Incas, who they were able to take gold that was already ready-made into fine items, melt it down, beautiful items, now gone, and turn it into bullion, which they were able to bring back to Spain. But later they also opened up silver mines, silver, that commodity that was in desperate need in China. And so they began to amass wealth of their own. Which leads us to the discussion of the Spanish conquest of the great empires. How did they do it? Well, we've discussed it in part, but in part it had to do with their access to technology. The guns that they developed in part because of knowledge of better bells, as it were. Access to horses. Certainly, the New World had no horses. All the horses you see in the New World, including the great wild Mustangs, are actually escaped from European sources. There were no draft animals here. And organization. They had a particular set of military organizations that had been developed through their own war-clad histories. But also of great significance were the germs they brought with them. Various diseases such as measles, tuberculosis, flu, whooping coughs, smallpox, even the common cold proved deadly to the indigenous populations that had never come across these diseases before. Now, many of these appear to have been spread from the animals as well, that they were just picked up. These were diseases that would kill Europeans, true, but many Europeans had resistance to. But the Native Americans and Native South Americans had no such resistance. And the impact of that can be seen quite brilliantly from the censuses done by the Spanish of the Native American populations of Mexico between 1518 and 1593. In 1518, when Cortés first encountered the Aztec Empire, there was an estimate of 25 million people living in Mexico. By 30 years later, there was only 1/5 of that population. 4/5 of the populations, 20 million people, died of disease, primarily of disease. They also died from being killed, don't get me wrong, killed, murdered, and shot by Spaniards, but the vast quantity of people died of disease. And by 1593, there was less than 1/10 of the original population left. Fewer than 2.5 million people. About 1 million people. The population had been devastated, primarily by disease. Now, at around 1600, looking at the Spanish and Portuguese wealth that was coming into the New World, or coming in from the New World, and the idea that there was great wealth to be gotten, other European nations decided to join the race. French settlements formed in Canada. Dutch colonies were formed as well, primarily on the island of Manhattan, thus the famous bead story. And English colonies were made in the West Indies and along the east coast of North America. Now, the English initial contacts were made by a variety of different people. Some of them, including William Penn, who was a member of Parliament, made a series of very sophisticated treaties with the native population. The indigenous populations of the Lenni Lenape, for example, ended up with a treaty with Penn, and there was initially some reasonably good relationships there. That obviously changed in different time periods. The French had a slightly different approach. Their routes, as you can see, were a little bit different. As you can see, in order to head westward, they had to tack across the North Atlantic, always a dangerous prospect. Back and forth, they tack and tack and tack until they got to what's called Hudson's, what's the mouth of the Quebec area, and landed here and founded their city of Quebec in New France up north. They also went southwards, either from Marseille throughout or from La Rochelle, and tacked their way across until they hit the trade winds, which could bring them to their southern holdings in Saint-Dominique, Haiti, and New Orleans. And their empire was, again, slightly different from, say, what the English were to produce. Now, in order to understand the difference between the Northern European and the Southern European, particularly the Iberian approaches, one has to understand the nature of who went across. The conquistadores were primarily men, almost entirely men, and many of them let out from prison in order to go and find wealth in the New World. They did not bring families with them. Whereas, say, English and French immigration, particularly the English immigration, was often family related. The population came with the desire to get land and to grow from it. Now, some of that population were indentured servants. Some people associate indentured servants as slaves. The two are not the same. As an indentured servant, you can get your freedom. As a slave, you cannot. But the indentured servant would work for a certain number of years and then be given their freedom and in some places actually given land. And this map shows how many people went to each of the different areas and from which different region. You can see that the West Indies had 110,000 people. Why? Because that is where the money was to be made in the form of sugar, which we'll get. Now, the Europeans had an insatiable desire for sugar. It was low-cost energy in one sense. It was also delicious, as we all know. And so there was a need to work the plantations, these sugar plantations that were taking over the majority of the West Indian zones. And despite the fact that there were 110,000 people from England alone that went to that zone, that still wasn't enough to work the plantations. What's more is people wanted an even cheaper way to work the plantation, something more affordable. And that is in part what led to the purchasing of African slaves. You see, you had to pay an indentured servant eventually. They earned their freedom and they got land for it. But a slave, well, you could work a slave to death. And as long as you got enough work out of them before they died, it was a profitable element. Now, slavery was an ancient institution, remains illegal now finally across the whole world, but it's had its roots in every culture. There has never been a culture that I'm aware of that has not had at least some element of slavery within it. And the Europeans, having traded with certain populations amongst the Africans, started buying slaves from some of the populations in Africa, which created a mercantile desire for that. So it created a trade out of the slave process. It encouraged some populations, most of them Africans, some of them Europeans, but usually with Africans on their side, going out and raiding villages and capturing people and chaining them up and putting them in the most horrible conditions where vast numbers of them died. And yet still enough would come out at the far end in the West Indies or later in the Americas, both North America and South America, that there was a healthy and profitable making slave industry. And still, even so, slaves were cheaper labor than it was to use white people, even white criminals who had to work to gain their freedom. And so the African slave trade was born. Now, in Spain, in Spanish territories and Portuguese territories, I had already noted that there was a difference in the populations. The French and the English tended to bring whole families over, or at least they'd start with only one indentured servant, but then that person would earn land and they'd bring their family along with them so that they could come to the New World. But the Spanish populations did not do that. Instead, what you had were primarily men, many of them having been freed from prison, but also young sons and nobles, the kind of people who want to go and take other people's gold and force them to work in silver mines. But they didn't bring their families with them. This was a fortune to be made for them and them alone. And that led to a large number of the kind of people who believe that slavery and forcing people to work in mines is okay, a large population of single men of that mindset being available. And the kind of people that they are often led to what one might refer to nicely as interbreeding. both with the indigenous populations and with the African slaves. Now, this led to a much wider dispersal, a gene pool, shall we say. But Europeans being what they were, they still had to keep everything very, very separate from one another. So we, of course, know what a purebred a Spanish and Spanish person would produce as another Spanish person, but they had to start coming up with names for all the different types of other crossbreeding, to use the most unobjectionable term I can think of. So a black person with a white person would be called a mulatto. There were names for half Indian, half African. There were names for half Indian, half European. There were names for people who were half Indian, half European, and half Indian, half African. There were names for every single form of caste that exists. And you can find these in the casta paintings. And they're fascinating, fascinating pieces, because often what they're showing are families. Often you're seeing these families are actually kind of happy in their own way, but they are also hyper dividing the racial differences between populations so that you know exactly what to call somebody who has got 1/8 indigenous population, 1/8 white, 1/4 African, 1/4 whatever else we want to throw in there. It was an exact science of what to call every type of racial mixing you could come up with. Now, what were they after? What were the Europeans after? Well, initially, that is certainly the Portuguese and the Spanish were after gold and silver, but there were other things they were after as well. They wanted the potato and the tomato. Those are both plants that are indigenous to the Americas, but not indigenous elsewhere. You think Irish have potatoes? The only reason the Irish have potatoes is because the Spaniards went and stole them from the Andes. They brought back maize, corn, which proved as popular in Europe as it was in North America and South America, and as popular it is today. They brought back that incredibly powerful drug, tobacco, which had been used for religious purposes primarily amongst the Native Americans, but became a commodity to be harvested and planted and harvested by plantation owners. They brought back chocolate from Mexico. Tea came from China, but that was also brought to the Americas, along with coffee from Africa through the Middle East. The tea and coffee were brought to the Americas for the use and pleasure of the European population. So this is what became known as the Columbian Exchange. And this created a commercial revolution in Europe. First of all, it began trading on a world stage. That is to say that Europe tied itself into the rest of the world. Previously, it had been, as I said before, something of a backwater. But at this point, it became tied to the more wealthy other nations around the world. They had their own direct access and exploitation of the populations of the Americas. They had their direct access and exploitations of the populations of Africa, and they had access to the wealth of both India and China. It also ended up in inflation. That is, the changing of value of money because of the sudden excess of it. Gold lost some of its value because there was a huge amount of gold coming out of the Americas. Silver, which was getting rarer and rarer in China, and as you know from your readings, was the engine of the Chinese economy, also lost some of its value. But it also created global trade connections and a need, a desire, an ability to get different luxury goods from around the world, silks and fine porcelain from China, far better than anything the Europeans could make. It started, or at least it gave real boost to the ideas of capitalism. That is to say, the idea that you would create money to, you would use money to accumulate more money. You would use money to accumulate items that you could then turn into money. Did it begin earlier? Well, almost certainly yes. But once the Europeans entered into this sort of global trading, where particularly where luxury goods were being traded as well as foodstuffs and things like that, it created a real birth of capitalism, a real growth spurt of capitalism, and gave birth to that most capitalist and Western of concepts, the joint stock company. That is to say, a company, a corporation, an organization that is owned by a number of individual investors who pool their money together to buy a resource such as a ship and items to put in that ship for trade, and then send that ship out, and when it comes back, the profits are divided amongst those stockholders. The birth of Wall Street can be found in the 1600s. But it also gave birth to a concept of mercantilism. That is to say, a political element in controlling the balance of trade. Governments began to realize that they needed a control of foreign trade because it's important for national security. If your economy is tied to a global economy, then you have to control the way in which that economy flows back and forth, because as happened with the Spanish, for example, they brought in a lot of gold and silver, but they spent almost all that gold and silver in the 30 Years' War initially, and in other wars later, hiring mercenaries, buying weapons, things like that. You have to realize that there is a finite number of resources, and eventually those things run out. And what you want, therefore, is a positive balance of trade. Now, what do I mean by a positive balance of trade? Well, this is something that's confused Americans a lot in recent years. You can have a trade surplus and you can have a trade deficit. What that means is a positive balance of trade is you want more items being made in your country to be sold elsewhere than you want items made in other countries to be bought in your own country. Why is that? Because that means that you have more money coming in than you have going out. Makes sense. So when we say we have a trade deficit with China, what that means is that we actually buy more from China than China buys from us. But they also wanted to, the European countries also wanted to maintain that relationship with the colonies. They wanted a positive balance of trade with their colonies. They wanted the colonies buying more from them than they were bringing in from the colonies. The colonies existed primarily for the benefit of the mother country, not for the benefit of themselves. All of this together helped create a concept of a sort of economic nationalism. That is, a sense of state identity tied to your own economy. And that led in particular in Britain to the formation of state-run banks. And indeed, it was the British formation of the state-run banks which helped it tremendously in what we'll be discussing soon in the long 18th century, in the numerous wars that were to occur, and particularly its conflicts with France. And that also resulted in economic regulations. In order for governments to control foreign trade, they had to have economic regulations. They had to maintain control over what was sold and when and how. So all of these economic changes fueled European expansion until by the end of the 17th century, by 1700, the world looked something like this, where you can see that France held much of North America, that England held some pretty icy areas up in Canada, but also held the majority of the east coast of the United States, where Portugal held a wide variety of colonies in Africa and in the Pacific Ocean and the China Sea, giving them vast access to those much desired wealths of India and China, and where the Dutch held a few colonies in South America, but also held the Cape of Good Hope, very important for trading around into the Indian Ocean. And of course, where Spain held much of North America in the form of Mexico and all of Central America, as well as the areas known at that point as Gran Colombia, that being the west coast of South America. And it led to a huge expansion during all of that time period, during which also, you will note, the wars were going on in Europe over the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War and things such as that. So, what it saw was that the 16th and 17th century was an intense period of expansion of Europe across the globe, and a great divergence of previous economic situations, where Asia had previously been, and actually by the 17th century it still was, the center of where most of the wealth in the world was. But Europeans started to become dominant. Why? Because they started to control trade, in part because they had ships that were well designed for traveling across seas, in part because they had excellent navigation skills that allowed them to go farther away from shore than others, and in part because they had cannons on their ships and would blow other people out of the water. Did this create the triumph of Western culture? Well, we talk about the triumph of Western culture, or at least some people do, as if we've won. But you may have noticed the world continues on. Western culture certainly had its day in the sun, and we are certainly enjoying it now. Will that always remain the case? Who knows? At the moment, Western culture does seem to be dominant, but for the longest period, Asian culture was dominant. And if you remember back to the charts earlier, there is a beginning of shift of economy that maybe Asian powers would become dominant again. Regardless of that, however, what happened in this age of exploration had a profound effect on the rest of the world. The Americas would never be the same. The indigenous populations were devastated by disease and by war and by slavery. Their lands were taken from them. Many were forced to work and die in silver and gold mines. Africans were taken from Africa and spread around the world in the form of slaves, particularly in North and South America. They had hundreds of years worth of indignities and horrors put upon them treated as property. And even those left in Africa ended up eventually being heavily dominated by European colonial empires that would, as I said before, the colony existed for the good of the motherland, and therefore the good of the people who actually lived in that colony, even if they happened to have been living there before it was a colony, was secondary at best. It also changed the balance of power in Asia, where China started losing its cultural dominance. Other things that occurred, we certainly discovered the nature of the world. Ships improved, navigational instruments improved, and we discovered the concepts of longitude and latitude, new technologies which were crucial for the development of the European empires that we will eventually be discovering later. The ships included the Portuguese caravel, which led to things such as the frigates that you see right there. Well, that's actually a sloop that you see right there, and eventually warships such as the HMS Victory you see over there at the far right of the screen. And what fed this drive was first the economy, a desire for more national wealth and national power. There was a desire for individuals to be part of a powerful nation, that the nation state that you belong to, for the good of your country, for king and country, we will go forth and colonize the world. And along the way, also make a lot of personal wealth as well. There was certainly a desire for personal wealth. Nobody went to the New World from Europe thinking that they were going to go there and be poor. It was wild, speculative capitalism, an attempt to gain your own wealth, and at the same time build the wealth and power of your nation. There was a religious component. There was a desire to spread Christianity around the world, and through that, save people's souls. That was the thought, at least. And this was fed by the rise of competing forms of Christianity, where Protestants and Catholics each wanted their own form of Christianity to be the one that is spread throughout the world. And there was the development of new ships and new navigation techniques that helped feed Europe's spread throughout the world. And that then brings us to the last of the topics we'll be talking about today, which is the scientific revolution. I know, you were all hoping that I'd shut up already, but no, we're plowing forward. Why? Because I have you captive. So, the scientific revolution. So while all of these things were occurring, there were changes in ideologies and approaches. And what we're going to be looking at in this last bit of the lecture is the paradigm shifts in the way the world was viewed by Europeans, by the West. We'll look at the old views and the new views, the way things changed. We'll look at the introduction of the scientific and development of the scientific method, and the relationship between science and religion, which has not always been what we tend to think of it as. We'll look at popular ideas such as witches and magic and witchcraft, and we'll look at something else. We'll address the question, was the scientific revolution really a revolution, or was it just a continuing on of traits that had been started from the Renaissance? So, big picture, we're going to look at the new world of reason and reform and the nature of the scientific revolution from 1480 and Copernicus through 1600 with Galileo, the rise of Descartes and Newton by 1700. And how does that fit into the really big picture? Well, if you look at where we are down here, you will note that we've got Copernicus in this zone occurring at about the same time as Louis XIV and the rise of the Tudor dynasties. That You have a long period of exploration during which you also get the Protestant Reformation, and you start getting the things such as the French Wars of Religion occurring, so that all of that is well underway by the time Galileo comes along, which in part goes to explain some of the issues regarding Galileo and his role with the Catholic Church. This is the same time as Elizabeth I that Henry III is assassinated to make Henry IV the first of the Bourbon kings, and where you see a change from the Tudors to the Stuarts. As we move forward through the time period, we have Descartes appearing at around during the periods of the 30 Years' War, where Louis XIII and Charles I, which we'll talk about a little bit later, are going on. We have Cardinal Richelieu, and we have English, French, and Dutch exploration occurring, as well as a long history of African slave trade. By the end, we are getting to the point where we have Sir Isaac Newton occurs at about the same time that the Glorious Revolution in England is over, and there is a restoration of the monarchy, and indeed, very shortly thereafter, the removal of the English monarchy and replacement by William of Orange and Mary, who, by the way, is James's daughter. We'll get to that later. Meanwhile, Louis XIV rules in France and makes France the most powerful nation in the world. So this is what's happening on the picture scale. Now, in 1962, a man named Thomas Kern wrote the book Structures of the Scientific Revolutions, and he noted that scientific fields during this time period, during the 16th and 17th centuries, that is 1500s and the 1600s, underwent a paradigm shift. It wasn't linear or continuous progress. It was rather a series of new leaps of information, new approaches that had never been considered valid before. That a whole way of looking at the world was developed, that was the scientific method, and that scientific truth exists as objective data, that is, things you can objectively observe and write down, and subjective understanding, that is, a consensus of the scientific community that this data can be interpreted in the similar way. That is what scientific truth consisted of, at least according to Kern. And that often there were competing paradigms, and that such competing paradigms frequently account for a reality that can't be coherently reconciled. So that is to say, if you have a religious view, that it is not always easy to reconcile that with a scientific view. Now, to look at this in a different way, let's say life was discovered elsewhere in the universe, that there was other intelligent species. What impact would that small discovery, that one discovery, have on our culture as a whole? Well, it would probably be tremendous. And that was nothing compared to the kind of discoveries that Copernicus and Galileo made, and how that impacted their culture. Now, in the old world, the old view, we had the Ptolemaic system, where Aristotle's concept of physics had the world divided into four basic elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And that Ptolemy, who existed in 90 to 168 AD, came up with a model of the world that pretty much matched what he could observe. That the world consisted, the universe was centered on the Earth, and that around the Earth orbited the sun and the moon. Here's the moon. Here's the sun moving along. And that the planets were on spheres that would explain their loop-de-loop patterns, because I don't know if you know this or not, but if you watch the way that planets move across the night sky across the year, you'll notice that they have what's called a retrograde motion. They move forward for a while, then suddenly they move backwards, and then they move forwards again. What we're seeing there is, in fact, the difference in our orbit versus the orbit of that other planet. But to people who did not realize that the Earth was not the center, what they thought was that the planets existed on different plates, that they would do these loop patterns based on the nature of the great machine, the universe. Or put simply, that the Earth was the center of the world, and that the sun and the moon revolved around it, and everything else went around it as well. Now, we know that's not the case anymore, but at the time you can imagine what a paradigm shift it was to go from an Earth-centric world universe to a sun-centric universe. That is, where we are about one, rather than the world revolving around us, we are about one of a number of worlds that revolve around something else. And this is what's referred to as the Copernican revolution. Why? Because it created a totally new worldview based on scientific observations and the use of Mercatoring maps. It created a heliocentric universe, that is, a universe in which the sun was the center of the world rather than the Earth. And that is a fundamentally different way of looking at the universe than had ever been done before. Now, who was this Nicolaus Copernicus? Well, he was an observer who, scientist who observed all of his different elements, noting that the stars were fixed, and that the sun was at the center of the world, and that the Earth revolved around the sun, and that the moon revolved around the Earth, and the orbits were all perfect circles. Well, he got that wrong. They're actually not perfect circles, but that seemed to match his view. And these were all the facts that he wrote and published and didn't actually have to really deal with, simply because he died shortly after the publications. But that led somebody named Johannes Kepler, who was a German and Lutheran astronomer, to look at these things and develop them a little bit farther. And he developed the 3 laws of planetary motion. One, he noted that the planets were not in perfect circular orbits, that there were elliptical orbits, and that's what explained retrograde motion of planets. 2, he noted that their velocity varied based on their distance from the sun. 3, he noted that the relationship between planets can be explained mathematically. So he brought mathematics to the study of the stars, and noted that the celestial machine is in the likeness of a clock. That is to say, that the world, the sun, the universe, the solar system, works in a mechanical efficiency. Now, those observations were made known to the person who's known as the father of modern science, Galileo Galilei. He was a physicist and an astronomer. He noted the concepts of motion and friction. Friction, of course, slowing things down, that without friction, motion would continue on. He improved telescopes tremendously, so much so that he was able to discover 4 moons circling Jupiter just from his own little telescope. And he championed heliocentrism and published on the concept of heliocentrism tremendously, so much so that he was found guilty by the Inquisition of breaking their rules. Now, actually, what he was found guilty of was not saying that the world was centered around the sun, but rather publishing this fact without approval of the people who paid for him to do this research, which was in fact the church. But all the same, that was a form of banning, and the banning did not go over very well. He also said that the universe cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and the characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering around in a dark labyrinth. Now, he had his troubles, but he ended up living a reasonably long life, and then eventually that leads us to Sir Isaac Newton, who was an English scientist, astronomer, physicist, and alchemist on the side. And he wrote Principia Mathematica in 1687, which noted that there are three laws of motion: inertia, acceleration, and action or reaction, and that he created the law of universal attraction. In other words, he discovered gravity. Now, that's not to say he discovered it and people were floating around beforehand, but he put into a scientific model the concept that larger objects attract smaller objects, and that the three laws of motion. He, in other words, created physics as we know it today. And through these individuals and individuals like them, you see the development of methodologies of science. And that is the real strength of science. Science is not a philosophy as much as it is a series of methodologies that are placed together. New methods of discovery were created based on the basic questions of how do things work? And what do we mean when we mean the truth? It is based on a concept of skepticism, which is one reason why watching science portrayed in movies is always frustrating when people do things like say, "Don't you ever just believe that an answer is true?" says one scientist to another. And that is the antithesis of what science is about. One should always be questioning. One should always be a skeptic in science. That reasoning should be based on observation and mathematical laws. And observation should be based upon direct observation and experimentation. That is to say, you don't just come up with a theory and put it there. You should make experiments to see if that theory should work. Sometimes those experiments take a while. Like, for example, it took us a while to go to the moon. Major people involved in the emergence of scientific methodology included Francis Bacon, who rejected the ancient authorities. He refused to believe that Aristotle was right just because he was Aristotle. He wanted direct observation himself. He went about collecting data and writing it down and created a proponent element for inductive reasoning as opposed to just deductive reasoning. That is, working from a particular to a general, seeing that he can observe that when I bounce a ball off the ground, it bounces up to a certain height. Does that have to do with the nature of the ball or the ground? And will different balls do different heights? How much of that has to do with the pressure I'm putting down? He notes a specific thing and then starts working outwards to say, does this relate to all balls or is it a nature of something else? In 1620, towards the end of his life, he wrote The New Instrument, which helped popularize science, particularly in Europe. Many shall venture forth, and science shall be increased. Then came another great developer in the methodologies of science. In my view, perhaps one of the best developers, which is René Descartes, who lived between 1596 and 1660. And his book, Discourse on Method, which of course is written in French. It doesn't say Discourse on Method. It's different altogether. But in it, he defended deductive reasoning as being detached reasoning of the individual mind. And he questioned all forms of authority and observation. Cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This is a very key to understanding the elements of development of science, is this phrase right here. Because what Descartes did was he questioned all forms of authority, including his own observations. He went forth and he doubted his own eyes and his own ears and began to question, what do I know is real? He questioned first what he knew was real based on what others had said, and then what he knew was real based on what he observed, and noted that he could be dreaming all of these things he's observing. So how does he know that these things are actually happening? How does he know that another person actually exists? He can't know another person actually exists. Another person might be the figment of his imagination. All he knows for certain is that he is a thinker, and that thinker is thinking. That somewhere, someone exists. Him, probably, but it may not even be him. He may be the dream of another being, but he knows for certain that someone thinks, and therefore that someone exists. And that is the fundamental principle on which science is based. That is the only a priori bit of knowledge one can have, that there is a thinker thinking. Everything thereafter, every thought, every interpretation, every observation is based on a supposition that those observations are real. So, what then is the scientific method? Well, it's pretty straightforward. You make an observation, and then you invent a hypothesis to explain that observation. You then go forward to test that hypothesis. If it passes, that's great. You test it again, and get other people to test it. And if it passes a lot of different tests, it changes from a hypothesis into a theory. If it fails the hypothesis, if you test the hypothesis and it fails, then you go back and invent a new hypothesis to explain that initial observation, or to explain the subsequent observations you've made during the different hypothesis testings, then how that ties into it. And then you keep testing and testing and testing until it passes. And once it passes, that hypothesis passes, you have a theory. Then you go forward and test the theory. If you test it enough time, if you test it and it fails, you go back to your hypothesis and create a new one to try to explain it and go through that whole testing theories. But if it passes, and it passes repeatedly, then many passes change a theory into a law. And a law is something like the law of conservation, or say the law of gravity, that gravity has a certain things. Of course, if you ever turn around and find that your law is wrong, which could happen, then that fails and you go back and invent a hypothesis to explain that observation again. And this led to a booming of a scientific population, including the creation of the scientific society, the Royal Scientific Society in England. And this also created the watchmaker analogy. And the question of, is there a design in nature? The question there is, if there is a watch, there must have been a watchmaker. It could not have happened randomly. And this is in a theory that's been around for a very long time. The idea of intelligent design or what have you, that if something exists, it must have been created, and if it was created, someone must have done the creating of it. Whether you accept this or not is wholly up to you, but it is an idea that was put forward at this time first and had its birth in the earliest elements of science. It does not, however, mean that one need to be scientific to accept that that is, in fact, the case. Anything but that. One who is scientific questions everything, including questioning questions. Now, the other thing that occurred at this time period was, while there was this advent of new discovery and new understanding, there was also a growth in the concept of magic and witches. And some of this was tied, in fact, to some of the sciences. In fact, some of the sciences went very close to witchcraft. Alchemy, for example, was based on the nature of trying to change elements by discovering the true name by which God made them. But other elements were also based on the core-rooted superstitions that existed in the society at the time period, as well as leftover concepts of heretics and heathens and things like that. And between 1561 and 1670, there were a peak of witch hunts in Germany. There were between 40,000 and 100,000 people burned as witches in these time periods. Burned to death in Germany and elsewhere. They certainly existed elsewhere. There were witches burned in England and France and everywhere, but it reached their peak in Germany during this time period. And even in the Americas, we of course are familiar with the Salem witch trials between 1643 and 1665. But as my father used to tell me, one of the things that's most interesting about the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts was not the fact that there were witch trials, because as you can see, such witch trials were common throughout the West at the time, but in fact that they were trials. Normally, what would happen in Europe is somebody would say, oh, that's a witch, and people would go out and stone them or burn them or something like that without bothering with a trial. In Salem, there were, in fact, trials, and that was quite unusual at the time. So what does this leave us? This knowledge is booming, but superstition remains. Well, the question is it a revolution? Or was it an evolution? Certainly, it was a paradigm shift in human thinking. There was a difference in the way Western people started to think about the world. And that controversial ideas, such as the fact that the sun was the center of the world, the universe, rather than the earth, began to get a wider acceptance. And certainly, it invented the scientific method. That system of hypothesis creation, testing, and retesting to create theories that are tested and retested to create laws which are questioned at all times. It also set the tone for what would become the culture and spread of the Enlightenment. That is, a society not just based on belief systems and religious fervor, but also on other ideas. For these were observations in physical science, but the Enlightenment is often considered more important because it dealt with social sciences. Yet despite all of this, popular beliefs, such as an old woman who looks at me funny has put a curse on me so I should burn her at the stake, were slow to change. And they remain slow to change. Society does not change as quickly as ideas. Now, this revolution spread to medicine, astronomy, and chemistry. I have not been ashamed to learn from tramps, butchers, and barbers, says Paracelsus, the famous physician who wanted to know all there was to know about medicine. Andreas Vesalius made vast studies of the human body. So this wasn't just focused only on natural observations of the world around us, but also of the body itself. And Anton van Leeuwenhoek, I cannot pronounce that, I apologize, he used the opposite of a telescope, the microscope, for the first time to view bacteria and the microscopic world, and through that begin to understand that the nature of the world was even more complex than what we could observe. Now, this created battles over the new ideas. There was, of course, Galileo's famous trials, where he was found guilty by the Inquisition of going against the church. And there was a religious nature to it, because there are many who believed that the core nature of science was not to question God, but try to understand the world in which God put us. As Sir Isaac Newton put it, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So he, Sir Isaac Newton, the sort of demigod of physics, as he is often seen, was very much a Protestant, devout Protestant, in fact, devout Puritan believer. And they did not believe that science and religion were incompatible. Indeed, most of these people, many of them, were related to the church in some form or another, or a church, I should say. All of which led to science, education, and the Enlightenment. 1759. It's a picture of the famous image of a Turkish observer pointing out astrological views of the world, but the Europeans not taking him seriously because he is dressed as an Ottoman. And that then leads us to the really big picture. And just take a quick look to see how all of these things fit together, because next we are leaving the 17th century and going into what is called the long 18th century. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it.